So this is an exciting time because of the widespread availability of mobile devices, everything from your smartphones to tablets and so forth. And not only are they mobile, so students can take it around with them and sort of feel ownership of it, but also they have gestural interfaces where you can express the movement part of what you're trying to learn about. It's not just pointing and clicking that we had before. And so those two things together make this a time when we can use those to help improve student learning, we think. So we're going to start off with Ayelet here, I think, and move on.
Professor John Black was my advisor, and I'd like to present you just a very short presentation about what I've been doing since then. I established a company that's called iGeneration, and the company, and I will present you a case study that we developed in iGeneration that actually was based on my dissertation, and it became a commercial product. So the product that I'm talking about is MathGlow. It's an educational app for math. And our vision in iGeneration is developing cutting-edge educational applications that are backed by proven academic research. As you know, there was an explosion, or there is an explosion of apps in the past 3 years since the iPad came up, and before that even the iPhone. And I started this journey a long time ago, before the iPad and the iPhone were in the market. I got interested in the Surface prototype that was developed initially by Microsoft years ago, probably in 2006, as far as I remember. And then I decided I would like to explore gestural interfaces. At the time, I don't think the name was even out there. So specifically, I was interested in basing my research, or exploring embodiment theory research. I saw embodiment first for, I know not everyone familiar probably with the embodiment theory, so just in a very, very big picture, it's about movement by moving our body, we actually can support our cognition and learning. But it depends how we move it, and what we explore in the cognition lab for the past few years is what are the best ways of implementing the embodiment theory to education. Is that working or not? Yeah, because thanks. Again, like I said, I started around 2006, 2007 to explore that, and I realized that actually with the technology that started to be available back then, there was the HP multi-touch computer that was a big thing at the time, and I realized that except the touch aspect, there is the movement aspect, which is the gestures. And based on the embodiment theory, it's something that we should explore how to best implement it to support cognition and learning. So in my dissertation, I actually decided to divide these two variables of movement, meaning gestures that the users are using, and touch, and explore these two separately and see how we can best design, taking in consideration these two variables. So there was a lot of research, there is a lot of research, but also back then about physical manipulation with real objects and how these can support cognition and learning. So that was not related to technology. We're talking about manipulatives, for example, and how they support, for example, math education. Or there is research about reading comprehension and how children who played with the characters, the physical character of of the story comprehend much better the story. So that's when we're talking about embodiment and physical manipulation of the object, that's what we mean by that. And applying it to digital interfaces, it's interesting because it's in between the physical aspect, because we're using more our body with the touch screens, right, the gestural interfaces, but there is an abstract layer there, which is less physical. So I want to introduce you briefly the case study that, like I mentioned before, it's called MathGlow. And this is 2 games for developing basic math skills. And this was developed by iGeneration as a commercial app, but it's based on my dissertation that we explored specifically the gestures and the touch. There are 2 games. Glowing blocks on the left is about addition and counting, and racing numbers is about number line estimation. And it's ranged from 4 to 7 years old. There are different modes that are age appropriate. MathGlow research was tested. We tested it in 2 schools, about 130 kids between the ages of 4 to 7 years old. And we managed to prove that the kids that use MathGlow on iPad performed better than the kids that used mouse-based interface, so a laptop with a mouse, without using the touch screen of the laptop. So that was a big discovery, but specifically how they used it better, I think it was even more important. They also were fully engaged. So like I said, we divided the 2 parameters of the touch and the gestural conceptual mapping. And my theory was that if we develop for gestural interfaces, we really have to have congruency of the gestures that support the concept that we're trying to teach. So for example, if we're teaching counting, it has to be, and the child count virtual blocks. I'm just going to jump for an image to show you. Oops, sorry, I jumped too much. If the child counts individual blocks, then the gesture that he uses has to be discrete, because counting, the concept of counting is a discrete movement. So, for example, so we tested a version where the child would press on each individual block to count and to add up the sum. And we compared it to children that would actually use non-congruent gestures. So they would either just click on the number 3 and the other number, and then on the sum, without actually feeling the quantity, the discrete quantity that they're counting and adding up. And we found out that the children that used the congruent gestures performed better. So that was, and then we tested the same thing with the kind of opposite gestures. So this is a number line task, a number line estimation task, where the child actually has a continuous concept to solve here, because he has to estimate where number 63 is on the line between 0 to 100. And it's a continuous quantity here. So we used a gesture that is continuous. He would drag this bar, the green bar, and we try to estimate where is number 63 on the line. Sorry. Now that was the congruent. That's a touch screen. Yeah, that's true. That was the congruent gestures. And to contradict that, the incongruent gestures was just clicking on one point to estimate where number, in this case, 54. And again, we found the same thing, that the continuous gesture that was matched to that was mapped correctly to the concept of continuous estimation supported the performance and the results. So going back to summarize that, I don't know how much time I have, 1 minute, thank you. So children had a significantly higher percentage of correct answer. Children use advanced strategies significantly. Oh, that's the touch screen again. Okay. And I think, sorry. So it was another thing that was interesting, except the higher percentage of correct answer, is that they actually used advanced strategies. And the children that used in the addition, in the counting and the addition game, the children that actually use the congruent gesture did not count on their finger as much as the children that did not use the congruent gestures. And it makes so much sense because children embody their experiences all the time. I mean, we know that young children, and even sometimes we can do that in maybe large number if we want to, we always embody our arithmetic on the finger. And so that was another interesting finding about the strategies. They also use an advanced strategy that's called count-on strategy with the iPad, and they did not use it with the mouse-based interface. So it's very important for me to emphasize that I do not think that any design is going to be better with gestural interfaces, mobile gestural interfaces. I don't believe that at all. I believe we have to research that and be very specific. And in this case, the congruent gestures, I think it's important to find out what, it's not congruent in the sense of, oh, it's easy to use. That's another kind of topic which is important. It's congruent in the sense that it supports the content, the concept that you're trying to teach. And it's a big difference between the usability to the actual content comprehension.
The name of my project is M3, and it stands for Mobile Mathematics Movement. And what we are doing is trying to teach fractions to 3rd and 4th grade age demographic under the premise that in the hierarchy of math, it goes identity, magnitude, arithmetic operations, and then fractions, which includes proportion, ratio, and scaling. And once you can perform that, then you can move on to algebra, and then you can move on to every other domain of math. So fractions becomes this linchpin for learning, and that's what we're addressing. This is my research team. These are the cartoon characters that we work with in conjunction with WNET 13, and I should thank also the National Science Foundation for this cyber learning grant that we were awarded for this project. So let's see. I tried to pick an interview that actually you can hear. So she's explaining her concept of fractions. Watch her gestures. It's a deictic gesture. That's a spanning gesture. That's a spanning gesture with both her hands. That's a beat gesture. And you see this circling forward, that's a procedural gesture. Okay. So the reason I show this clip is to kind of exemplify the fact that underlying the conceptualizations for fractions are these movements. So Ayelet covered a little bit that it falls under this paradigm called embodiment. Embodiment is basically says it's almost like a learning by doing. In terms of the neuroscience behind it, you have spinal cortical tracts that innervate up your spine. The efferent signals and afferent signals go out to your periphery, come back in. Your perceptions get integrated through your cerebellum. Your cerebellum feeds into subcortical structures including your basal ganglia, which then innervates to your thalamus, and then your thalamus sends projections to all different parts of the cortex, and these are the underlying foundations why our movements are connected to our thoughts. So in fractions learning, these are obvious questions to us, but they may not be obvious to a young learner of fractions. But what is a whole? What is the part? How many parts make up the whole? How big is this part? And is this part equal to that part? So essentially what you're talking about is how big is the magnitude of something, and then taking that magnitude estimation, identifying it to its formal reference in symbolic mathematics, i.e. Arabic numerals. And then once you can identify how big a fraction is, if I give you another fraction, can you compare the two and determine which one is larger, which one is smaller, or if they're equal? So the foundations of mathematics is essentially, it comes from how we interact with the world every day. And it starts with take yourself back to the caves and say, hey, I'm hungry, I want something to eat. I saw a tree outside, it's got red things hanging from it, I'm gonna go get one. And then next thing you know, you meet a nice spouse at another cave, and now you have to go get 2 red objects. From object collections, then you're talking about, you say, how far did I go from the cave to the fruit tree? And what that is that's the distance. So now you have a start point. So now mathematics is not just objects, but it's distances along paths. Then once you understand it in distance along paths, let's say you discover that you can collect more red objects if you bring a basket with you. So now you have a container. And that container is not necessarily unitized. It doesn't have little measurements on it. But you can estimate how many objects you can put in it. And then later on, let's say that you decide that you have discovered some potion that a medicine man in the next village says, take this much of it. But you don't want to take too much, so you devise some way to measure that amount. And once you develop units, then those units can be used as the last form of mathematics. So you have objects, distances, and measurement. We covered embodiment, so we'll move through that. Okay, so gestures. Just real briefly on gestures, there's 4 basic types. The first one is deictic gestures. That means you, and you. Iconic gestures is to say it was really round. A metaphoric gesture would be like if I say, hey, look, I've got an idea. An idea is not really a concrete thing, but I am making a metaphor with my gesture to show that concept. And the last one is symbolic gestures. And some of the things we see with the kids learning is they will actually use the symbols and they will gesture them in the air. They'll say, oh, I need 3 of them. I drew that backwards for you. Okay, so in terms of the gestures that have been seen throughout the academic literature, they include everything from grasping, pointing, chopping, segmenting, object collection, depictive gestures and drawing, trajectories and boundaries, and distances. So in the exploratory study that we just completed for the M3 project, we found pretty much all of these different gestures are not just associated with conceptual learning across a number of domains, but they actually get integrated into fractions learning as well. So we developed a metric, and we integrated all these things: tool usage, multiple solutions, allowing students multiple opportunities to evaluate themselves. And these are really the considerations that we're taking in terms of developing the game for mobile devices. We want to offer them a simulation, something that gives them contextual relevancy. We want to give them a tool, whether or not it's a digital tool within the game that they control with their finger. We want to offer them multiple solutions. So you may be able to solve it and get a silver cup, but if you solve it the best way, you get a gold cup. So you have an incentivization, motivational, intrinsic motivation. And then in terms of process and product, there's a term called productive failure, which says that actually failure is a great teacher. So make the process that they iterate in terms of their learning part of the product that they're going to produce. And then the last one is external representation. So this is kind of moving into offering them different scenarios and different ways to think of what it really means to fracture something. This is, well, you definitely can't read that. But this is all the different types of gestures. And the gestures that we found in the study that we just did, there are gestures for comparing quantities, counting quantities. the process of fractioning, like slicing something, chopping something, pulling something apart. There are gestures for identifying things, estimating the magnitude of things, operationalizing things, conducting arithmetic operations or a proceduralization. And last one is for referencing, when they say this one right here. Oh, there's 3 parts out of 5, right? And then the last part is, so this is not our actual game, but these are the mock-ups that we submitted to the National Science Foundation. And the way this game would work is you have a pedagogical agent. The agent is saying, find me this quantity. There's an inactive gesture, the process of swiping across. And this is a continuous gesture, kind of in line with what Ayelet was talking about. And here you have them taking the quantity and summing it together, pinching it and bringing it together. And so each one of these would be a different process. They get feedback from the pedagogical agent. Feedback then gives them opportunities for multiple trials. And the idea is that by the time they get to the end of this exercise, they will have completed it successfully. You give them multiple opportunities to do that in a number of different contexts, and that's the idea behind the game. Last thing is, I think I covered most of this. So we've got the pedagogical agent, the instruction, continuous gesture, the covering the domain between wholes and different fractions. And then what you can also do is offer different levels of scaffolding for students. So if this is kind of overwhelming and they don't know how to divide this up into eighths, if you're asking them to find 3/8 of it, then you can do things in the digital platform where you can add scaffolding lines that would then assist them in the development process. So we just finished our research, and what we did was we found out what gestures kids use when they're talking about fractions, and now we're moving into the development phase of the game. And I look forward to maybe talking to you next year about the actual game.
So I'm Ilya. Thanks for coming. I'm a PhD student here studying with Professor Black, and I want to thank you for having me on the panel. I also have this fancy sounding title of Director of Mobile Development at a startup called Broadcastr based in Brooklyn, and we have an app called Spun. It's on the App Store. You guys can check it out. And I also write fiction, and I say that because all these things do actually fit together, believe it or not, so I'm going to try to explain how. So my background is both in CS, computer science, and in creative writing. Did a bachelor's in computer science and then a master's at Stanford, focusing on human-computer interaction for my master's. And I also did a creative writing minor. And I'm going to talk quickly about the different projects I've been involved in that have involved gestural interfaces. And all of these projects combine my 2 interests in these 2 disciplines of fiction and technology. So the first project is called Storied. Someone, I think, introducing me was kind enough to say was well known. It's not, but I did co-found this project, this company called Good to Know that created this product. And the idea here was learning vocabulary, reading original stories. So the research behind that is that you can learn vocabulary effectively through repeat exposures in context. So we felt that this would be a better way to learn than just rote memorization with flashcards, but flashcards were also integrated into this product. I'm just going to go really quick. I worked with a literary magazine called Electric Literature, and this was back in a day when, a few years back, when the publishing industry was still kind of unsure about what to do about e-readers. These guys were pretty forward-thinking, and we were the first to actually put a literary magazine on the iPad. And we also used the publishing platform to help other magazines and small presses get their content on the iOS platform. They actually also got, Electric Literature got like some sort of literary award for it, but I don't remember the name of it. So I just wanted to include this because this was a proud moment for me. I felt like really did something useful for the world. We built the Human Rights Watch iPad app. So Human Rights Watch, of course, publishes reports on human rights abuses around the world, and we built an app to help them do that. So then came Broadcastr. Broadcastr is a geolocation-based storytelling app. And what that meant was you could record a story and pin it on a map, and then people out in the world with a smartphone could listen to that story. And so it was kind of like, we called it the museum tour of the world. And then, we worked on that starting in May 2010, and the product evolved. We released version 2.0, which was a little bit more slick. And then we were working on version 3.0, and we realized that we didn't have a very large user base, and in the language of startups, we had to pivot. So we developed something called Spun City News, and that's what I work on now. And Spun City News is basically an aggregator of local content. So there's a bunch of blogs and outlets that write about your city, and you may not have the time to read about it. You may not even know about these blogs or bigger outlets. And so this app combines all this stuff and lets you find it in an easy way. So it's on the App Store. You can learn a lot of interesting things that are happening in New York from it. So I've been doing this for about 5 years now, working with iOS development, or doing iOS development. And I've learned some things in the process, and my colleagues. So not everything should be an app, one thing that we learned. As an example, we used to build standalone book apps. That's really no longer the way things are done. You have your iBooks, you have the Kindle, and that's a more convenient way to get your books. Technology breaks and evolves, so when you build an app, you have to maintain it, and it's a big pain, and it takes a lot of resources, and it's expensive. So, for example, we just had to shut down our previous app, Broadcastr, because there was not enough users and because we couldn't devote resources to maintain it. So discovery, big barrier. There's like 1.5 million apps now on the App Store. And statistics I heard recently was that only about 60% of them don't ever get downloaded, which is kind of crazy. And on top of that, Apple now and similar companies with app stores actually don't have a motivation to help you find apps because they make money off advertising. So they want you to pay them to advertise your app, so they actually make it more difficult now to discover apps. Another one is cater to existing motivations. Very hard to make somebody do something they don't already want to do. So successful apps find something that people already want to do and let them do it a little easier. Instagram, case in point. Delight the user. So gestural interfaces in themselves are fairly delightful, but let's say you get the user to find out about your app, you get them to download it, already pretty difficult, and you get them to use it, then you want them to use it again. You want them to come back. So re-engagement, big deal. And the way to do that, Michael was talking about the basal ganglia. That's sort of our organ that gives us that sense of delight. So if you can do that with sounds, with graphics, with interesting little interactions, that's a good thing to do. So all this time that I've been developing iPhone apps, I was also writing fiction. I didn't forget about that, so this is how it all comes together. And these are just some of the magazines that I've been published in. Epiphany and Bellevue Literary Review there in the top left are actually New York-based publications, so they're local. And so out of this combination of art and technology, education sort of naturally grew out of that. And that's because art is inherently instructive. It's always communicating something. I always think of Inception as sort of a good metaphor for art. They're trying to implant an idea in your head. So that's what art does too. And the other thing about art is it's visceral, right? It engages your emotions. That's sort of by definition what it does. And it's been proven, well, it's been shown in research that people learn better actually when their emotions are engaged, when they are emotionally, care emotionally about what they're learning. So, and what does art communicate? What is it teaching? It's basically teaching about other people, right? Teaching about other situations, worlds, times, and so on, and how people behaved, felt, and situations they'd countered. So what that really is that's empathy, right? You're understanding other people in engaging with narrative. And actually what narrative is, again, research has shown, I'm just gonna reuse that phrase a lot, research shown that empathy is actually you simulating the emotions of the other person in your own mind. So you're engaging a system in the brain called mirror neurons, where you're actually simulating the other person feeling sad or angry, and that's how you understand how they're feeling, and that's essentially empathy. And so by extension, when you're doing that, when you're simulating other people's emotional experiences, you're learning about yourself too. But the problem with art is that it's indirect, right? It's show, not tell. That's what, when a writer's starting to write, you tell them, show us, don't tell us. If Joe is angry, don't tell me, show me how he's angry. And that's great because that's what engages us, right? We're watching Joe be angry, and that's what pulls us in. But you lose, potentially, or you may miss the thing that the artist is trying to tell you. He's showing you something, but he's also trying to tell you something. But that indirection may make you miss the thing he's trying to tell. So how do we make sure that that thing is not missed? Well, there are a lot of ways to do that, but technology can potentially help. So this is a project I was involved with most recently outside of Broadcastr. It was at an organization called eDesign Lab, and it's called Reading Robot. And basically what this is about is helping improve kids' reading engagement. And so successful readers, right, they engage in certain activities naturally. They ask questions about what they're reading, they imagine what they're reading, and they make inferences about what they're reading, and they do some other things too. But and other readers who are less successful, they don't do that. So this was aimed at trying to encourage, trying to teach and prompt readers to engage in these activities. So the way we did that is you have a little robot avatar, and somewhere along the line in the narrative, you tap a little button, that little button right there, and the little robot pops up, and he speaks to you. He asks you a question. He says, wow, that was interesting. What do you think about that? And then the reader responds, and that hopefully engages them in this way. Now, really quickly, so the advantages of building an app like that, because I talked about disadvantages of building apps earlier, but there are advantages, of course. Build once and distribute infinitely. There's interactivity, the gestures that we're going to be hearing about more in a minute. And there's individualized learning. So in the case of Reading Robot, when somebody answers a question, depending on how they respond, let's say, oh, I don't know, the follow-up question that the robot will ask them is actually going to adjust. So there's individualized learning that this allows. Progress and activity tracking, so an instructor will know where in the narrative the student is and what they're doing, what they're up to in the system. Better use of instructional resources, so through this kind of system, an instructor will actually know, okay, here's the student that is struggling, and this is exactly what they're struggling on, so they can actually direct their attention exactly where it's needed. And easier iteration. So with apps now, it's not unusual for a new version of an app to come out every couple of weeks. So it's like incremental iterations very quickly. Okay, so Reading Robot was kind of a general way to increase reading engagement. My specific research interests are focused, and this is an outgrowth of my work in narrative, is emotional awareness. And as I'm sure we know from our own lives, emotion is very important in life, but recent research has also shown that it's very, very important in learning. There's a growing body of research that's showing that, and which is why emotion regulation is very important, again, both in learning and in life. If you're not able to regulate your emotions, they can really get in the way of you attaining your goals. Now, successful regulation depends on the understanding of your emotion system. That's true of trying to regulate any system. In order to regulate it or to make it work correctly, you have to understand how it works. And we just talked briefly about how narrative involves mirroring character emotions. So when you're reading narrative, this is another bit of research, you're doing the same thing as when you're looking at another person and you're mirroring their emotion. The same thing happens when you're reading back characters and you're trying to understand why are they behaving the way they're behaving. So out of that comes a natural, or at least to me, a natural idea to use narrative in combination with all the advantages given by technology to teach about emotions. And that's what I'm interested in. That's what I'm hoping to do in the next few years with Professor Black at TC. So not a lot of talk about gestures. I apologize. I just figured I'd go off script a little bit. Thank you.
In reference to the app,
Yes.
I heard there was a very young kid.
Yes. Oh, yes.
App to Google for $2 million.
30 million.
Yes.
Yes.
And how old is he? I think
17. He's 17. Yes. I'm just a little older. So I'm still hoping. I'm still waiting for Yahoo's call.
What was the idea behind it?
Oh, don't get me started. This is the app is called Sumly, and the idea behind it was it would automatically summarize news stories for you. So if you don't have time to read through the news story, and you want a little bit more than a headline, this machine algorithm would go in and it would actually summarize it. Now the problem was this didn't really work well, and the technology wasn't actually this kid's. He actually licensed it from the company, so it's a mystery what Yahoo wanted, and there's a lot of resentment you can hear. I'm sure there is. It's very mysterious. Maybe they just wanted a face to seem more youthful, and maybe it was a PR move, $30 million PR move.
So actually, pull out your phones. I'd like to see what phones you have, if you wouldn't mind. What are we all working with here? If you have a BlackBerry, you're not alone. I have a 3-year-old BlackBerry, and if you heard in the intro, I do some mobile learning stuff, and you can apparently still do that on BlackBerry. So don't be embarrassed. So what do we have? Just so who does not have a touchscreen phone? Me. So the only gesture you can do with this is just throw it at a wall. Maybe that's with BlackBerries in general because they're frustrating. But the interesting thing that I see, I mean, what do you think gestures are? There's been a lot of talk for the past 30, 40 minutes, but I'm curious what you think gestures are, like in relation to your phone or something touchscreen. Anybody want to throw out something? No? Yeah.
Intuitive finger movements.
Okay, finger movements. What else? Yeah.
My personal feeling is that it's my representation that comes out of my concept in my mind and it goes through my body to explain myself.
That sounds very deep.
You're talking about
Well, we have concepts in our mind.
spontaneous gestures, not with the
To
phone, right?
explain, yeah, to explain
Spontaneous gestures in communication, which is just sorry to
No, go for it.
but this whole research about gestural interfaces and gestures is kind of started from research about gestures in communication, the spontaneous gesture that I just used now.
So what type of gestures do you use on your phone? Okay, so moving the whole device, right? Okay, so that's one. What else? Yes. Okay, so this is, for those of you, SWYP, right, the swipe. So basically, a big issue with mobile devices in general, as you may know, especially as they go to more towards touchscreens, is input is very, very difficult. And this is why I think, specifically why you're starting to see more on this gestural mobile phenomenon going around. Because if you've ever tried to type a very long email on your iPhone, it's very difficult, right? And so what this swipe does is that you have a touchscreen keyboard and you just keep your finger on it and then you just move from letter to letter without ever actually lifting your finger off. And so with a little bit of training, I mean, maybe you can verify that you can type faster than just pressing them one at a time. So what else? Yes. Ah, the keyboard. Yes. Yeah, this is. Yeah, that's. And so it kind of brings up a question. Well, we were all born with using physical keyboards or whatever else, right? Keyboard and mouse. I mean, this is really what I think of this whole gestural movement. It's trying to find a better way for input. I mean, that's what I boil it down to. And when we talk about input, really, like on a computer, it's a keyboard and a mouse. And you know, when the iPad came out, so many people were amazed that 2-year-olds or maybe 6-month-old could just take an iPad and just go around with it. But really, when you think about it, is that that sort of makes more sense, right? Because you're manipulating the object directly as opposed to using a mouse and then cognitively connecting your hand mouse movement with a pointer on a screen, right? So that's sort of where I think we've gone recently. But so back to this alternative input, right? So any iPhone or anybody have an iPad here by chance? So here's a problem that I think that's going on with gestural interfaces now. It's education, right? So do you know what the different types of maneuvers that you can do? Like for instance, if you have an iPad, is that one of the newer ones? Do you know that if you do 4 fingers and raise 4 fingers up, then you can get like a bottom menu there. And then a friend of mine has a new Samsung phone, so where he was sort of showing off that his phone was better than my BlackBerry, which any phone is really better than my BlackBerry. But what he did is he just had his phone and he just swiped his hand right across like he was wiping the screen, and it took a screenshot. I was quite amazed. Now my next phone is going to be a Samsung. So, but point being is that that's only good if you know that that's available, right? So I think there's this learning curve, and we're in sort of the infancy stage where we need to figure out how do we get high up upon that learning curve there. So so that's another thing. And it's important to understand that it's available. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I guess we want to make sure that we have some time to discuss some more, is does it have to be limited only to hand or finger movements? And so and my personal opinion is no. And the big thing that I'm seeing is that if you look at the big input method that's happened in the past couple years, any guesses on what you think it is? I mean, there's no right or wrong answer, but yes, voice, right? So what are the two big things that have happened in the past few years? One is this Siri from Apple, right? That's coming out. And then on the other side, it's the IBM plug, but that there was that supercomputer, Watson, right? That went on Jeopardy. And that was, it used speech to text and text to speech. And that's starting to get really popular on to mobile devices because, again, it gets back to what's the problem right now with mobile devices. It's inputting information. It's extremely difficult, and you don't want to spend a lot of time to do it. So how do you alleviate that issue? Voice is a good way, and these other gestural commands. But the good news about voice is nobody needs to teach you how to speak, right? But you know, swiping and doing all that, there's a learning curve that you have to know that that's available and connect that this does this. So those are some of the things that I think are sort of big going forward. And the last thing I would say, just to connect back to the work at IBM, is we spend a lot of time, if you think about nothing else, think about accessibility. So for those who are hearing impaired or visually impaired, we spend a lot of time with the sites that we have. In order for them to just be used in what we call a production environment, they have to be accessible. And so what that means is that you have to have, again, alternative methods. So an easy way for those who may be hearing impaired or speak another languages, all our videos have to have captions, right? And also we go through extensive reviews for those who have any visual impairments that they can still use the site. And if it doesn't match it, then we can't launch the app, even if nobody uses that feature. But a lot of companies have gotten sued for very recently. I think Target was one recently. If you work at Target, sorry about that. But that's something to keep in mind, is alternative methods to input. And I guess with that, I'll stop and hand it back over to Dr. Black.
I mean, really quick. Part of the challenge with any technology is that technology's often, well, fragile. It breaks. And it has to be usable, which is challenging to do. So there are a lot of interesting technologies out there, but you know, touch interfaces had also been around for a while before Apple came along and actually made it really, really universally usable. So it's often difficult to translate sort of a novel technology into mass, usage. So that's one of the challenges. If you want to learn how to program, there are a lot of different ways to do that. If you just want to develop an app, I would echo Michael and say, funding. But there's several tools that enable you to build apps in a different way. So Adobe has a tool where you basically build like a Flash and system. It's different from coding in Objective-C for iOS, and then translate it into an iPhone app. I guess one would need to know, what are you trying to accomplish? In what sense do you mean break in? Do you mean to be a developer? Do you mean to develop a product? There are different challenges.
I have a few ideas for apps
Sure.
that I would like to develop myself.
Sure.
And maybe, I don't know if there's commercial value in it, but I would like to be able to have that.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, sorry.
I was just going to, Xcode is Apple's platform for basically, it's a WYSIWYG program. WYSIWYG is an acronym for what you see is what you get. It's a visual interface. And that's actually designed to help novice programmers be able to put Objective-C together, so you might want to check that. It's a free download on Apple's website.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, it's not you still have to actually write the code with Xcode, so it's not like a.
Okay,
it's not like a visual.
let's get another question here, back there.
You're talking about gestures. One of the items that has really been useful in the classroom has been the clicker, where you can get a sense of what all the students are thinking. Now, one of the things I was expecting when we went to this classroom with the future was something like that would be built into the seats. use that to do the clicker sequence in the classroom, where you can survey the class regarding questions on any subject.
So the short answer is there is one. I use it in the classes that I co-teach. It's called Poll Everywhere. I mean, there's a lot of them, but that you can send a text message as a SMS, or you can go to a website or whatnot, and it updates in real time. You can integrate it on a PowerPoint site, so there are some things like that.
Yeah, so I think that's replacing the clickers. That's
Yeah.
why it's not there. Yeah.
Well, even here we see that with smartboards, I see them so underutilized in schools. And I'm actually writing a paper on this. The training is inadequate, and even the placement, right? It should be on the short end side of it. Well, and I see this over and over again where they put it smack dead center on the long wall. And what I've also observed is that teachers who do use smartboards effectively, they use it from the teacher station with a laptop. They don't get into the sort of the stalled engagement with the students. So there's a gap there. And so I'm thinking more, for the price of that, give everybody an iPad type device with direct manipulation, and probably you'll have more engagement from the students. And are you familiar with Minsky's work on epistemological cycles, where people are locked into the technology that they learned on, and that's what they used to teach with, and they never get out of it.
That's what Apple uses to get people to keep buying their products.
Okay, one final question, George.
I wondered if there's any movement towards a universal gesture design that's not based on the technology, or based on body language, or based on different cultures' body language.
Well, it's all based on, you mean specific?
Well, normally, I mean, typically now, there's certain gestures, but it's based on being able to do certain things on a phone. And I'm saying eventually, like, imagine people walking on the street kind of dancing.
Yes, of course.
It's
So,
the body that are interpreting, you know, the messages they're trying to send to some device. Or
so
maybe-
free-form gestures, we didn't talk about it as much because we talked mainly about devices that are involving touch. And I think that's what you mean, that we're using all our body, and it's called in the industry or in the research free-form gestures. And I think if you talked about the future classroom, or even not just the classroom, of course we will be more and more immersed with this kind of interaction, either at home or anywhere, even outside, where we, swiping our hands and interacting this way. And it's all, I think, I don't know if you guys saw the Corning, probably a year ago, the Corning movie, A Day with a Glass. Anyway, it's a movie about the future immersive interaction with our body and with all the environment around us outside. So the kids are in the forest, and they actually have some dinosaurs, virtual reality coming towards them, and they're learning this way, and they swipe it. So, I mean, it's going to get there, and I think we're working at iGeneration with Intel on some of the freeform gestures